The executive conference room at ConocoPhillips Houston headquarters carried the measured confidence of a global energy company with operations spanning 6 continents. In late April 2007, senior management reviewed quarterly reports from Venezuela's heavy oil projects, where the company held significant stakes in 2 major Orinoco Belt ventures. The Petrozuata and Hamaca projects generated substantial cash flows from approximately 180,000 barrels per day of upgraded synthetic crude oil production. Financial presentations showed consistent profitability from operations that had required over $4 billion in initial investment since the late 1990s. Regional executives provided updates on expansion possibilities and long-term extraction projections, while highlighting the strategic importance of Venezuelan reserves that totaled over 1 billion barrels of recoverable heavy crude. The discussion reflected institutional certainty built on signed agreements, established legal frameworks, and successful operational history spanning nearly a decade. Board members examined risk assessments and contingency planning that addressed various scenarios affecting international oil investments, though political risk factors appeared manageable within existing contractual protections and diplomatic relationships. The foundation of partnership. ConocoPhillips' Venezuelan operations emerged from the country's 1990s opening of its petroleum sector to international investment, when the government sought foreign capital and expertise to develop massive heavy oil reserves in the Orinoco Belt. These deposits represented some of the world's largest petroleum accumulations, but required advanced technology and substantial financial investment to achieve commercial viability. The challenging characteristics of heavy crude, including high viscosity and sulfur content, demanded sophisticated extraction and upgrading processes beyond the capabilities of Venezuela's state oil company, Petróleos de Venezuela S.A. The Petrozuata project began operations in 2001 as a joint venture between ConocoPhillips, which held a 50.1% operating interest, and PDVSA, which owned the remaining 49.9% stake. The partnership invested approximately $2.8 billion in extraction facilities, upgrading infrastructure, and supporting systems that processed 120,000 barrels per day of heavy crude into synthetic crude oil suitable for international markets. The project represented one of the largest private sector investments in Venezuelan history at that time. The Hamaca project commenced production in 2004 through a similar partnership structure, with ConocoPhillips holding a 40% stake, alongside PDVSA's 30% interest, and other international partners, including Chevron Texaco and ExxonMobil. This venture required additional investment of over $1.5 billion to establish production capacity of 190,000 barrels per day, making it one of the world's largest heavy oil processing facilities. Both projects operated under profit-sharing agreements that provided Venezuela with substantial revenues through taxes, royalties, and PDVSA's ownership stakes, while granting international partners operational control and guaranteed returns on their investments. The arrangements reflected established international practice for petroleum development in countries lacking sufficient capital or technical expertise to develop complex reserves independently. The legal framework supporting these investments included bilateral investment treaties between Venezuela and the United States, international arbitration clauses, and constitutional protections for foreign investment that had been established during the 1990s to attract international capital. These legal protections provided security for long-term investments while ensuring that disputes would be resolved through established international mechanisms rather than local courts potentially subject to political influence. The operating environment ConocoPhillips Venezuelan operations functioned within a broader context of international oil company investments across Latin America and other emerging markets. The company's global portfolio included projects in Russia, Kazakhstan, Canada, and other countries where political risk considerations required careful assessment and management. Venezuela's democratic institutions, established legal frameworks, and history of honoring international contracts provided confidence for long-term capital commitments. The projects employed thousands of Venezuelan workers while transferring advanced technological capabilities and operational expertise to local personnel. ConocoPhillips established training programs, technical education partnerships, and supplier development initiatives that created broader economic benefits beyond direct project employment. These activities supported the company's social license to operate while building relationships with local communities and government officials. Venezuela's oil sector provided approximately 95% of the country's export revenues and over 50% of government fiscal income, creating strong incentives for maintaining stable investment conditions and honoring existing agreements. The mutual dependence between international companies and the Venezuelan government appeared to provide sustainable foundations for long-term partnerships that served both parties' interests. The Orinoco Belt represented only a portion of Venezuela's massive petroleum reserves, with additional heavy oil deposits requiring future development through international partnerships. ConocoPhillips participated in ongoing discussions about expansion opportunities and new project development that could extend the company's Venezuelan operations for several decades, while providing additional revenue streams for both partners. Regional political stability appeared solid during the early 2000s, with Venezuela maintaining democratic institutions, regular elections, and peaceful transitions of government. The country's membership in international organizations, adherence to international law, and participation in global financial markets provided additional assurance that existing investment agreements would be honored regardless of political changes. The political evolution. Hugo Chávez's presidency, which began in 1999, initially maintained continuity with established oil sector policies while focusing on constitutional reform and social program expansion. The administration's early rhetoric emphasized Venezuela's reliability as an energy supplier and commitment to existing international agreements. Government officials regularly met with international oil companies to discuss operational issues and explore new investment opportunities. However, the political coalition supporting Chávez represented constituencies that had historically received limited benefits from Venezuela's oil wealth. These groups viewed international oil companies as beneficiaries of arrangements that provided insufficient returns to the Venezuelan people. Rising global oil prices during the early 2000s increased government revenues while highlighting the substantial profits earned by foreign companies from Venezuelan petroleum exports. The Chávez administration began implementing incremental policy changes that increased state control over oil operations and expanded government revenue collection from existing projects. New regulations raised royalty rates, increased tax obligations, and required greater Venezuelan participation in operational decision-making. These modifications affected all international oil companies operating in Venezuela, though they were generally accepted as normal adjustments to fiscal terms that occurred periodically in resource-rich nations. By 2005, the government initiated more comprehensive reviews of existing oil sector agreements, questioning whether international companies were receiving excessive returns relative to their contributions and risks. Venezuelan officials commissioned studies examining the financial terms of major projects while developing proposals for restructuring arrangements to increase state benefits and control. The political environment also reflected broader regional trends toward resource nationalism in Latin America, with governments in Bolivia, Ecuador, and other countries implementing similar policies to assert greater state control over natural resources. These precedents provided political cover and practical examples for Venezuelan policymakers, contemplating more aggressive measures to modify or terminate existing agreements with international companies. The strategic assessment ConocoPhillips management monitored political developments in Venezuela while maintaining operational focus and investment in existing projects. The company's risk assessment processes incorporated political risk analysis, but the evaluation concluded that Venezuela's dependence on international investment and expertise for complex heavy oil development would prevent dramatic policy changes that could damage existing partnerships. The company's regional strategy emphasized maintaining positive relationships with government officials while demonstrating value creation for Venezuela through job creation, technology transfer, and revenue generation. ConocoPhillips participated in various social investment programs and community development initiatives designed to build political support and demonstrate corporate citizenship beyond contractual obligations. Financial analysis indicated that Venezuelan operations generated substantial returns for ConocoPhillips, despite political risks and operational challenges associated with heavy oil development. The project's cash flows supported global expansion activities while providing strategic access to significant reserves in a region where the company sought to establish long-term presence and growth opportunities. The legal protections embedded in bilateral investment treaties and project agreements provided additional security for existing investments while creating substantial financial obligations for Venezuela if the government attempted to modify or terminate arrangements unilaterally. These legal frameworks had proven effective in resolving disputes with other countries and appeared to provide adequate protection for Venezuelan investments. ConocoPhillips's management also considered the precedent effects of potential Venezuelan actions on the company's global investment portfolio. Accommodating arbitrary changes to existing agreements could encourage other governments to implement similar policies, potentially affecting projects worldwide. This consideration supported maintaining firm positions on contractual rights and legal protections, rather than accepting modifications that might appear reasonable in isolation, but could create adverse precedents globally. The policy implementation. On May 1, 2007, President Chavez announced that Venezuela would assume majority control of all oil projects in the Orinoco Belt, including the Petrozuata and Hamaca operations where ConocoPhillips held significant stakes. The decision converted existing profit-sharing agreements into joint ventures with PDVSA, holding at least 60% ownership in all operations. Government officials presented the policy as legitimate exercise of national sovereignty over natural resources rather than arbitrary expropriation of foreign investments. The announcement followed legal procedures established by previous legislation, authorizing the conversion of existing oil sector agreements into joint ventures with state majority control. Venezuelan constitutional provisions asserting state sovereignty over natural resources provided additional legal justification for the policy change. Government lawyers maintained that the measures represented regulatory modifications rather than contract violations subject to international arbitration. Venezuelan officials invited international companies to negotiate new partnership terms that would allow continued participation as minority partners in restructured ventures. The government offered compensation for assets transferred to state control, while emphasizing that foreign companies could maintain profitable operations under the new arrangements. These negotiations provided opportunities to preserve some investment value while avoiding prolonged legal disputes. 3 international companies, Chevron, Total, and Statoil, entered discussions with Venezuelan authorities to restructure their partnerships according to the new requirements. These companies calculated that accepting minority stakes remained preferable to losing their Venezuelan operations entirely, while legal disputes proceeded through international arbitration processes that could require years to resolve. ConocoPhillips and ExxonMobil rejected Venezuelan proposals and announced their intention to pursue international arbitration to protect their investments and obtain compensation for losses resulting from government actions. These companies determined that accepting the new terms would establish adverse precedents for their global operations while providing inadequate compensation for the substantial investments and expected future returns from Venezuelan projects. The corporate response ConocoPhillips' decision to reject Venezuelan partnership proposals reflected corporate strategy that extended beyond immediate financial considerations in the specific projects. The company's management team assessed the precedent implications of accepting arbitrary modification of existing agreements, particularly given ConocoPhillips' substantial investments in other countries where governments might implement similar policies if international companies appeared willing to accept disadvantageous restructuring. The legal strategy involved multiple proceedings across different jurisdictions to maximize pressure on Venezuela while protecting corporate assets and interests. ConocoPhillips initiated arbitration proceedings under bilateral investment treaties, pursued asset protection measures in various countries, and coordinated with other affected companies to present unified opposition to Venezuelan policies. The company's arbitration claims totaled approximately $30 billion, reflecting not only the value of transferred assets, but also expected future profits from long-term production operations. ConocoPhillips argued that Venezuela's actions constituted expropriation under international law, violating treaty obligations and established legal protections for foreign investment. The claims sought full compensation for all losses resulting from government measures. Operational considerations also influenced ConocoPhillips's response, as accepting minority status would have eliminated management control over complex technical operations requiring specialized expertise. The company's executives determined that minority partnerships in heavy oil projects would not provide adequate returns while exposing ConocoPhillips to operational risks beyond their control. The dispute created immediate financial impacts for ConocoPhillips, including write-offs of Venezuelan assets and reduced cash flows from terminated operations. However, the company's diversified global portfolio enabled absorption of these losses while legal proceedings continued. Management emphasized long-term strategic considerations rather than short-term financial impacts in communications with investors and stakeholders. The international framework. The ConocoPhillips Venezuela dispute proceeded through established international arbitration mechanisms designed to resolve investment conflicts between multinational corporations and sovereign governments. The International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes, operating under World Bank auspices, provided forums for addressing claims under various bilateral investment treaties and international law principles. The arbitration proceedings involved complex legal questions about the scope of governmental regulatory authority, the definition of expropriation under international law, and the calculation of compensation for investment losses. These issues required years of legal argument, expert testimony, and evidence presentation before tribunals could reach conclusions about liability and damages. Venezuelan officials argued that their actions represented legitimate exercise of national sovereignty over natural resources rather than arbitrary expropriation subject to international law constraints. The government's legal position emphasized constitutional provisions, legislative authority, and regulatory modifications that fell within normal governmental powers, rather than contract violations requiring compensation. ConocoPhillips maintained that Venezuela's measures constituted indirect expropriation that violated bilateral investment treaty obligations and established international law principles protecting foreign investment. The company's legal arguments emphasized that the effect of governmental actions on investment value determined liability, regardless of the stated justifications or legal procedures employed. The arbitration proceedings also addressed procedural questions about jurisdiction, applicable law, and compensation methodologies that influenced outcomes beyond the specific ConocoPhillips case. These legal precedents affected similar disputes involving other companies and countries, while shaping international investment law development for future conflicts. The financial resolution. In 2013, an ICSID tribunal issued an initial award determining that Venezuela owed ConocoPhillips approximately $2 billion in compensation for the nationalized projects. However, this amount was subject to set-off provisions for various claims and counterclaims between the parties that complicated final settlement calculations. Additional proceedings continued to resolve remaining disputes about compensation amounts and payment terms. The arbitration process required over 6 years to reach initial conclusions, during which Venezuela maintained control over the disputed assets, while generating revenues from continued operations. ConocoPhillips received no income from the Venezuelan projects during this period, creating substantial opportunity costs beyond the immediate asset losses. Venezuela's payment of arbitration awards proved problematic due to the country's deteriorating economic condition and international sanctions that limited access to foreign currency and financial markets. The government's fiscal constraints, caused partly by declining oil prices and economic mismanagement, created practical obstacles to satisfying legal obligations even when tribunals ruled in favor of international companies. In January 2025, ConocoPhillips secured a final arbitration award of approximately $837 billion, representing one of the largest ICSID awards in history. This amount included compensation for assets, lost profits, and interest accumulated during the lengthy arbitration process. However, enforcement remained challenging due to Venezuela's limited internationally accessible assets and ongoing economic difficulties. The financial resolution provided legal vindication for ConocoPhillips's strategy of pursuing arbitration rather than accepting Venezuelan partnership terms. However, the practical collection of awarded amounts remained uncertain, given Venezuela's financial constraints and limited willingness to satisfy international arbitration obligations. The operational consequences. Venezuela's assumption of control over the Petrozuata and Hamaca projects resulted in immediate operational challenges as PDVSA lacked the specialized technical expertise and financial resources required for complex heavy oil operations. Production levels declined from previous performance as the state oil company struggled with maintenance requirements, equipment procurement, and technological management beyond their traditional capabilities. The departure of international partners eliminated access to global supply chains, advanced technologies, and operational best practices that had ensured efficient project performance. PDVSA's attempts to replace these capabilities through alternative partnerships and domestic development proved inadequate for maintaining optimal production levels and facility reliability. Technical problems accumulated as deferred maintenance, equipment failures, and operational difficulties reduced the project's productive capacity. The sophisticated upgrading facilities required continuous investment and specialized expertise that proved challenging for PDVSA to provide independently, resulting in declining output and increased operating costs. The broader Venezuelan oil sector experienced similar difficulties as other nationalized projects faced comparable operational challenges. The country's overall petroleum production declined significantly during subsequent years, reducing government revenues and contributing to the broader economic crisis that affected all sectors of Venezuelan society. International oil companies reassessed their global investment strategies to account for political risk lessons learned from the Venezuelan experience. Many companies reduced exposure to countries with higher political risk profiles while demanding additional legal protections and higher returns to compensate for expropriation possibilities. The systemic impact. The Venezuelan nationalization established precedents that influenced international investment relationships across the global energy sector and other industries, involving long-term capital commitments in emerging markets. Governments observed the successful assertion of state control over international investments despite legal protections and treaty obligations, while companies modified their risk assessment and contractual approaches. Other oil-producing nations implemented similar resource nationalism policies, including Bolivia's natural gas sector nationalization, Ecuador's oil sector modifications, and various African countries' revised mining agreements. These developments reflected broader trends toward increased state control over natural resources, often at the expense of existing international investment agreements. International arbitration mechanisms demonstrated both their value and limitations through the Venezuelan cases. While tribunals consistently ruled in favor of international companies and awarded substantial compensation, enforcement proved problematic when governments lacked willingness or ability to satisfy arbitration awards. These experiences highlighted gaps in international investment protection systems. The Venezuelan precedent influenced bilateral investment treaty negotiations and international investment agreement development, with both companies and governments seeking to address deficiencies revealed by the nationalization experiences. However, fundamental tensions between national sovereignty and international investment protection remained unresolved. Credit markets and political risk insurance providers modified their assessment methodologies to account for Venezuelan-style nationalization risks, increasing the costs of international investment while reducing available capital for projects in higher-risk countries. These changes affected global resource development and economic growth in emerging markets. The long-term legacy ConocoPhillips' Venezuelan experience became a defining case study for international investment risk management and political risk assessment in the global energy sector. The company's decision to pursue arbitration rather than accept modified partnership terms provided both vindication through legal awards and practical lessons about enforcement challenges in international investment disputes. The case influenced ConocoPhillips' subsequent investment decisions and contract negotiations worldwide, with enhanced political risk provisions, stronger legal protections, and more conservative financial assumptions becoming standard elements of international project development. These modifications increased project costs while potentially reducing investment in higher-risk regions. Venezuela's continued inability to pay arbitration awards highlighted ongoing tensions between national sovereignty assertions and international legal obligations. The country's economic difficulties, partly resulting from declined oil production following nationalization, demonstrated potential long-term costs of resource nationalism policies that prioritize political control over operational efficiency. The dispute contributed to Venezuela's broader international isolation and reduced access to capital markets, technology transfer, and international partnerships essential for economic development. These consequences extended far beyond the oil sector to affect the country's overall economic prospects and international relationships. Contemporary discussions about international investment protection, bilateral treaty effectiveness, and dispute resolution mechanisms frequently reference the ConocoPhillips case as an example of both successful legal advocacy and practical enforcement limitations. The experience continues to influence policy development and investment strategy formulation across multiple industries and countries. The $8.37 billion arbitration award represents one of the largest investment dispute settlements in history, though collection remains uncertain given Venezuela's ongoing economic and political challenges. The case demonstrates how governmental actions taken for immediate political benefits can generate substantial long-term financial obligations that exceed the short-term advantages achieved through nationalization policies. The fundamental questions raised by the ConocoPhillips Venezuela dispute about balancing national sovereignty with international investment protection remain relevant for contemporary global economic integration and resource development policies. The case provides frameworks for analyzing similar conflicts while highlighting persistent challenges in international investment law and dispute resolution.